At my own funeral, paralyzed inside my coffin, I overheard my wife and my private doctor kissing and planning to cremate me alive. The furnace roared. I had minutes left. They thought they'd won. Then suddenly my brother burst in, clutching something he'd salvaged from my mansion's trash. He roared a single sentence, and my grieving wife went dead pale. The last thing I remember choosing to do was drink the tea. It was chamomile. Victoria always warmed the cup before she poured, a small deliberate tenderness that I had taken as evidence of love for 11 years. She set it on my nightstand at 9:47 p.m. and brushed the hair from my forehead with cool fingers, and I thought, this woman loves me. I thought it clearly, consciously, as the tea went warm in my stomach and my body began to go quiet in a way I didn't yet understand was wrong. I didn't feel myself lose consciousness. I simply stopped. And then I woke up in the dark, and the dark had a smell, mahogany and something chemical, faintly sweet, and the dark had walls, close and smooth on all sides, and I understood before I could form the word for it. Coffin. I was in a coffin, and I couldn't move, not a finger, not an eyelid, not my tongue against my teeth. My body was a locked room, and I was standing outside it, hammering, and nothing answered. I could feel everything, the satin lining against my knuckles, the slight pressure of my own weight, the air growing warmer and thinner with every breath, but feeling and moving had become two entirely separate countries, and I had been exiled from one of them without warning. What I could do was hear. God help me, I could hear everything. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I was 53 years old, in what my cardiologist had called remarkable shape for a man who runs a company that size, and I had built Pendleton Capital from a 2-room office in Louisville into a private equity firm managing $340 million in assets. I was not a foolish man. I want to say that clearly because what I'm about to tell you will make me sound like one, and I think foolishness requires a choice. I did not choose what happened to me. I trusted the wrong people because they were very, very good at being trusted. Victoria Solano Pendleton, 41 years old when we married, a former architect with a laugh that filled rooms and an instinct for silence that I had always read as depth. She was beautiful in the particular way of women who know exactly how they look and deploy it with surgical precision, never overdone, always calibrated. She had been my wife for 11 years and my blind spot for every one of them. Harrison Greer, my best friend since college, cardiologist, the kind of man who could sit across from you at a dinner table and discuss your mortality with such clinical warmth that you left the conversation feeling vaguely grateful. He had monitored my heart condition, a minor arrhythmia, barely worth mentioning, for 6 years. He had access to my medical history, my prescriptions, and my home. And then there was Declan, my younger brother by 4 years, loud, reckless, twice divorced, perennially broke, the kind of man who showed up to Christmas with a bottle of good bourbon and somehow broke something expensive before dessert. Victoria referred to him as your brother's chaos in the tone other people used for weather. I had always defended him, not because I was blind to his flaws, I saw them clearly, but because underneath all of it, Declan was the only person in my life who had never, not once, wanted anything from me except my company. I should have known that was the most dangerous kind of love to be surrounded by. Looking back, the signs were there the way smoke is there before fire, present if you know to look for it, invisible if you've been taught the air is always a little hazy here. Victoria had become interested in the corporate structure of Pendleton Capital about 8 months before she put me in that coffin. Not aggressively, she was never aggressive about anything that mattered to her, subtly. Questions over dinner about board membership, about succession protocols, about what happened to a controlling shareholder's stake in the event of something sudden. I had a heart condition. The questions seemed natural. I answered them the way you answer questions from someone you believe loves you, honestly and without armor. Declan had called me in October, about 3 months before everything happened. He'd been staying in Nashville and he called from a bar, which meant I initially discounted everything he said, which was my mistake, and I own it. Something's off with Victoria, he said. You've said that for 11 years, I told him. Arthur, he paused, and the bar noise dropped behind him like he'd stepped outside. I saw her having lunch with Harrison last Tuesday, not at a restaurant, in his car, parked behind a parking garage on 5th. I was quiet for a moment. They're friends, I said. You know they're friends. They weren't talking, Declan said. I told him he'd had too much to drink. I told him he was projecting his own relationship failures onto mine. I was kind about it, because I believed I was being generous. I now know I was being catastrophically stupid. The headaches started in November. Mild at first, tension, I assumed end-of-year financial pressure, the kind of grind that came with managing a firm through a volatile quarter. Harrison adjusted one of my heart medications in early December. New formulation, he told me. Better tolerability profile. I noticed the pills were a slightly different shape. I said nothing because he was my cardiologist and my friend, and those two things together had always felt like a fortress of reliability. The headaches worsened. I started waking at 3 a.m. with no explanation. Not nightmares, just a sudden, jarring consciousness, like something had interrupted a signal. I'd lie there in the dark next to Victoria's sleeping shape and feel, without language for it, that something in my house had changed. Something structural, something load-bearing. I told Harrison. He ordered labs. He called 3 days later to to say everything looked normal. "You're under stress," he said. "Let's increase the Ambien. And Victoria mentioned you've been skipping the evening tea. The magnesium blend helps with cardiac rhythm. Make sure you drink it. The tea. Make sure you drink it." I have thought many times about that moment, the 48 hours before the end, when I was walking around my own house in the last days of my conscious life without knowing it. I reviewed the renovation plans for the Cape Cod property. I signed a disbursement approval for Q4 bonuses. I had a 20-minute phone call with our chief compliance officer about a portfolio review. I was completely functional, completely unaware. What I did not know, Victoria had been meeting with an estate attorney named Conrad Marsh for 6 weeks. What I did not know, Harrison had written 3 prescriptions in the prior month under a patient identifier that was not mine for a drug called vecuronium, a neuromuscular blocking agent used in surgical anesthesia to achieve complete muscular paralysis while leaving the patient fully conscious and aware. What I did not know, the board of Pendleton Capital had 2 members who were aware of what was being planned and had agreed, in exchange for favorable positioning in the post-Arthur restructuring, to say nothing. What I knew was that the tea tasted faintly different that night, slightly more bitter. I noticed it. I set the cup down. Victoria was in the doorway, watching me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Very still, very focused, like a person watching a timer they're not sure will reach 0. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said, "just tired." And I picked the cup back up and finished it. I don't know how long I was under before I woke in the dark. Hours? A day? There was no way to track time inside the box. What I know is that when consciousness returned, it returned fully, like a light switched on in a sealed room. Complete awareness. Complete imprisonment. The first voices I heard were the funeral home director's staff, speaking quietly about floral arrangements. The second voice I heard was Victoria's. She was maybe 10 feet away from the coffin, on the other side of what I guessed was a closed door. She wasn't crying. Her voice had none of the rounded, softened quality it got when she performed emotion. This was her real voice. The register she used when she was solving a problem, clipped and precise and cold as a filing cabinet. "What time is the cremation?" she said. "And Harrison?" 6 o'clock. "Once he's ash, there's nothing left to examine." 6 o'clock. I had no idea what time it was. I had no idea how many hours I had. All I knew was the math. The air was getting thinner, the wood was close, and the 2 people who had put me there were standing 10 feet away discussing my disposal like a contractor discussing tile removal. I threw everything I had at my own hands. Nothing. I tried my legs, my feet, my jaw, my eyelids. I tried to make a sound in my throat, tried to force air through my vocal cords by sheer force of will. The paralytic was absolute. Vecuronium, I would learn later, works by blocking the neuromuscular junction, the bridge between nerve signal and muscle response. Your mind screams, your body ignores it. You are a passenger in a vehicle with no steering wheel, watching the road disappear. I lay there in the satin dark and listened to my wife and my best friend divide what they expected would be my estate. Victoria. The residential properties, the Cape Cod renovation, the investment accounts, all of it structured through a life insurance policy she'd quietly doubled 18 months prior. Harrison. A seat on the restructured board, preferred share conversion, a letter of recommendation from Victoria to 3 hospital networks in the Carolinas, where he'd been positioning himself for a department chair role. They talked about it the way people talk about logistics, scheduling, sequences of events. The funeral performance for the board members was handled. The night nurse had been sent home at 11 p.m., which was why nobody was present when I died in my sleep. The paperwork was signed. The cremation was private, which meant no witnesses beyond staff. I had been planned for thoroughly. I will give them that. What they hadn't planned for was Mrs. Gable. Margaret Gable had been the housekeeper at Pendleton House for 17 years. She was 62, quiet, extraordinarily competent, and she had been present for every chapter of my marriage. I had always treated her well, not as a performance, but because it had never occurred to me to do otherwise. She had, apparently, noticed. When I'd hired her 17 years ago, I'd said something offhand during the interview. She repeated it to Declan years later. "If anything ever happens to me that doesn't feel right, call my brother first." I don't remember saying it. She had apparently never forgotten it. That morning, while Victoria was at the funeral home overseeing preparations, Declan arrived at the estate unannounced. Nobody had invited him. Victoria had explicitly told the staff that Declan was not to be admitted to view the body, citing the family's need for privacy in grief, a sentence that, delivered with a catch in her voice, was the kind of thing that made reasonable people comply without question. Declan was not a reasonable person. This is the moment I started thanking God for that. He drove 4 hours from Nashville on 0 sleep after getting the call from the estate's front gate, which had turned him away. He parked on the street. He walked around to the kitchen entrance. He had grown up in this house, same as me, and he knew every door. Mrs. Gable let him in. She was standing at the kitchen sink, twisting a dish towel with both hands in the particular way of someone who is holding something in that needs to come out. She looked at Declan for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "He asked me to call you first if anything ever happened." Declan looked at her. He did not ask her to explain what she meant. He knew. "The trash," she said. "Last night, around midnight, she put something in herself, didn't use the service bin." Declan went to the trash. He dug through coffee grounds and food waste and wet paper towels with his bare hands, and near the bottom, his fingers closed around something solid and small and amber. A vial, label mostly torn, almost completely clean. 4 letters remained. Veku. He took a photo of it with his phone. Then he called Meredith Cho, his former girlfriend of 3 years, who was a toxicologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and who picked up the phone with, "Unless you're actively dying or finally ready to apologize, I'm in the middle of something." "What is vecuronium?" Declan said. Dead silence. Then, "Where are you?" "My brother's house. He died last night. They're cremating him at 6. Meredith's voice shifted in a way that, later, Declan told me he would never forget. Every degree of warmth left it entirely. What replaced it was professional, precise, and very fast. Vecuronium is a neuromuscular blocking agent, surgical paralytic, total motor paralysis, conscious awareness intact, mimics death to any external examiner who isn't specifically testing for it. It metabolizes clean. Give it 8 to 12 hours and a tox screen won't catch it unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Declan looked at the funeral program someone had left on the kitchen table. Arthur Pendleton, private cremation, 6 p.m. "Meredith," he said, "if someone was given this and they were put in a coffin, would they be awake?" She said, "Completely." "Declan," her voice cracked on his name. "What time is it?" It was 4:22 p.m. He was already running. Inside the coffin, I had stopped trying to move, not from despair, though despair was present, sitting heavy in my chest next to the thinning air. I had stopped because I had read somewhere years ago that oxygen deprivation accelerates with exertion, and I had decided in the precise way you make decisions when you are a private equity manager lying paralyzed in a mahogany box that conserving what I had was the only rational choice left. So I lay still and I listened, and I thought about Declan. I thought about the phone call in October that I had dismissed. I thought about how he'd stepped outside the bar to make it, which meant he was sober enough to know it mattered. I thought about 17 years of Mrs. Gable and a single offhand sentence I didn't remember saying. I thought, please. The heat came first, a low ambient warmth through the wood, barely perceptible that grew by degrees. Then the sound, deep, industrial, a roar that resonated in my sternum. The furnace room. The cart had begun to move. I could feel the gentle, horrifying forward motion of being transported. The sound grew louder. I counted my breaths, each one smaller than the last. Please. Then the doors crashed open. Even through the wood, even over the roar of the furnace, I heard Declan's voice like a physical thing, raw and absolute and carrying 4 hours of road and 17 years of brotherhood. "Stop the cremation!" Victoria's response was instantaneous. "This is a private service. You need to leave immediately." Not a grieving widow, not a breath of surprise, a property manager addressing a trespasser. 2 attendants tried to physically intercept Declan. I heard the scuffle, the grunt of impact, the squeaking slide of dress shoes on tile. Harrison stepped in. His voice was controlled, performatively warm, clinical authority deployed like a weapon. "Declan, I understand you're in shock. Grief can make us feel like we need to act. Let me help you find somewhere to—" What silenced him was a sound I had never heard from my brother before. The flat, concrete thud of a man being put against a wall by someone who was done performing patience. Then quiet. "What does vecuronium do, Harrison?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a very long time when you are listening for a person's guilt. "Open the coffin," Declan said. "I am his next of kin," Victoria said, ice in every syllable. "I forbid this." "If he's dead," Declan said, and his voice had dropped into something that was worse than shouting, something bottomless and certain, "then his dignity can wait 5 minutes, and if he's alive, your inheritance can wait a hell of a lot longer." I heard the funeral director say something I couldn't make out. Then the cart stopped moving. I felt the change in direction, backward, incrementally, away from the heat, away from the furnace. Click, 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 light. The lid came up and light came down, and it was fluorescent and industrial, and the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in my life. I lay there, still, pale, silent, unable to do any of the things a living person does to signal aliveness. Through my barely open eyes, I could see Declan's face above me, the face of a man watching something he is terrified to believe, and hear Meredith's voice from his phone speaker, clear and sharp. Mirror, or any reflective surface, under his nose. "Right now, someone produced a metal tray, a lid from a catering dish. I don't know. It appeared beneath my nose, and I gathered everything remaining inside me, not for movement, which was still impossible, but for air. One breath, just one. The smallest possible column of air through the smallest possible gap in my chest. The tray fogged. A woman behind the attendant screamed. Declan put his hand on my chest, his palm pressed flat against my sternum, and I felt it, felt the weight of his hand, and I could not tell him that I felt it, but I could. One single tear, from somewhere that still worked, let something real surface. It ran from my eye down my temple into the satin. Declan saw it. His face collapsed. A man of 50 years of emotional armor just gone. He made a sound in his throat I hope I never have to hear again from anyone I love. "He's alive," he whispered. Then he turned. I heard him turn. "He is alive!" Victoria moved backward into a display of white roses. I heard the crash, the scatter of petals and broken broken stems, and for the first and only time, I heard something in her voice that wasn't calculated. It might have been the sound of a plan coming apart. It might have been fear. I have thought about which one it was many times, and I still don't know. Harrison ran. He made it approximately 6 feet. I heard the impact of two bodies in motion meeting one body trying to exit, and then the unmistakable sound of a man's face meeting a glass door, and then the flat, professional click of handcuffs. The paramedics came in fast. An oxygen mask covered my face. Real air, moving, cold and clean. And someone was doing the rapid assessment protocol on my vitals, and speaking in the clipped shorthand of people trained not to be shocked by things that should be impossible. The last coherent thing I heard before whatever came next was an officer speaking to Victoria in a tone that contained absolutely no deference to her pearls, her posture, or her 11 years as Mrs. Arthur Pendleton. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." "Do you know who I am?" she said. Still, even now, the handcuffs clicked. "Yes, ma'am," the officer said. "We know exactly who you are." The paralytic fully cleared my system over the next 19 hours. I'm told I blinked purposefully at about hour 6. I moved my right hand at hour 11. I spoke, one word, ragged and barely formed, at hour 14. The word was Declan. He was in the chair beside the hospital bed. He hadn't left. He looked terrible. Unshaved, hollow-eyed, still in the clothes he'd driven 4 hours in, and he looked at me when I said his name like a person watching something come back from a place they'd already accepted it was gone. He said, "I know, don't." I was quiet. "October," I said. "The call, from Nashville." He shook his head slowly. "Don't do that to yourself. You were right. I know." He looked at his hands. "I'm always right, and everyone always says it when it's too late to be useful." "It wasn't too late," I said. He didn't answer, but I saw something shift in his face. Not absolution. Declan isn't built for easy absolution, which is one of the things I have always loved about him. Just acknowledgement. Just the small, private reckoning of a man who showed up in time and is deciding what to do with that fact. Here is what the investigation found. Meredith Cho worked through the night with the hospital toxicology team to document the vecuronium in my system before it fully metabolized. She filed a formal expert witness statement, 14 pages, her name, her credentials, her methodology, that was submitted to the state attorney's office within 36 hours. A forensic pharmacologist named Sylvester Brand was brought in by the prosecution. Brand had spent 22 years in pharmaceutical crime and had a way of explaining technical things to non-technical people that stripped the escape route from every sentence. He testified that the dosage of vecuronium found in my blood work was consistent with deliberate administration to a person of my weight and cardiac history. Not accidental exposure, not environmental contamination, deliberate. Harrison's prescription records were subpoenaed. The 3 false identifier prescriptions were there. Sloppy, in retrospect, the kind of error made by a person who assumed the body would be ash before anyone looked. They were not the only sloppiness. His phone contained a deleted but recoverable thread of messages between himself and Victoria, spanning 8 months. The thread was recovered by a digital forensics analyst contracted by the state, a woman named Patricia Nkosi, who specialized in device extraction and who told the court, in flat professional language, that deletion is not erasure. The messages were not the messages of friends. They were the messages of people who had been planning something for a long time and had made the mistake of committing it to text because they believed they were untouchable. Conrad Marsh, the estate attorney, cooperated within a week of being subpoenaed. He turned over the full documentation of Victoria's estate restructuring work, including notes from their meetings. Notes he had kept, he said, because he had grown uncomfortable with the specifics around month 3 and had begun quietly protecting himself. I do not know what to feel about Conrad Marsh. He helped plan the legal framework for my murder and then surrendered it to save himself. I suppose, pragmatically, his self-preservation became my salvation, and that is a strange thing to hold. The 2 board members, Theodore Kane and Russell Elroy, were identified through Victoria's emails. Both had agreed to facilitate post-Arthur restructuring in exchange for favorable terms. Both were removed from the board, and both were charged with conspiracy. Theodore Kane, I was told by my attorney Josephine Park, had been smiling in the funeral home when the paramedics rushed in. He had still believed in those few moments that the situation could be managed. Josephine Park had been my corporate attorney for 9 years. She was methodical, thorough, and had a voice that somehow remained completely calm, even when describing things that were not calm. She sat across from me in a hospital conference room 11 days after the coffin and walked me through the charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, criminal fraud, estate tampering, illegal acquisition and administration of a controlled substance. Victoria is looking at a minimum of 30 years, Josephine told me. Harrison, because of the prescription falsification and the medical license implications, likely more. I sat with that for a moment. And the board members? Conspiracy charges. Their attorneys are negotiating. She paused. Arthur, you should also know the life insurance policy. She had doubled it without telling you. The payout on your death would have been $6.8 million. I had not known about the doubling. Harrison had referred her to the broker. $6.8 million. 11 years. There is one more thing. In the weeks after the hospital, when I was staying at Declan's place in Nashville because I could not yet bring myself myself to go back to Pendleton House. There were nights I lay awake and thought about the moment with the tea, the pause before I picked the cup back up, the almost. I had almost set it down. I've turned that over and over, the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking at the shape of it, the particular weight of the choice I almost made. And what I've decided, what I have to decide to keep functioning, is that the near miss is not the point. The point is what Mrs. Gable remembered, what Declan heard in October and didn't let go, what Meredith knew at 4:22 on a winter afternoon and knew meant run. The point is that I was not, in the end, alone in that box. Even when I couldn't speak, even when my body was completely silent, even when the furnace was close enough that I felt its heat through mahogany, I was not alone. That turns out to be the only thing worth saying about survival. It's been 14 months. Pendleton Capital is intact. A new board, restructured with oversight mechanisms Josephine designed with the specific paranoid thoroughness of someone who has seen what boardrooms can conceal. I run it from a different office, smaller, quieter, a third-floor room in a building downtown where I can see a park from the window. Declan is, by his own description, still a disaster. He is currently in the middle of a third divorce that is proceeding with considerably less drama than the first two, which he says represents growth. He calls me every Sunday. Sometimes we talk for an hour. Sometimes we just sit on the phone not saying much. I still drink tea. Not chamomile, never chamomile. But tea, dark, strong, nothing added. I make it myself now. Victoria's trial begins in the fall. I have been told I will be called to testify. I have been told it may be difficult. I've thought about what it will feel like to sit across a room from her, to look at her face in a setting where she can no longer manage what that face communicates, to watch the performance attempt and fail. I think I'm ready. I've been lying in the dark before. I know how to wait until the light comes.